The sun cracked overhead like it was tired of watching people fail each other. Heat rippled through the dust-heavy air in the border town of Calico Ridge, where even the dogs didn't bark unless they meant it. On a raised plank outside the general store, a woman stood barefoot, wrists bound by a fraying rope that had seen too many wrists before hers. Clara didn't cry. Her lips were dry, cracked from travel, but she kept them sealed like a tombstone kept its dead. Her braid hung limp over her shoulder, frayed at the end where someone had yanked it weeks ago. The man beside her, the man in the bowler hat with a ledger and no conscience, shouted over the murmuring crowd. Clean enough, might bear. No husband to speak of. Widow by abandonment or worse. She stared past him, past the people, past the buildings, until her gaze met the mountains on the horizon like they might save her. The sheriff stood in the corner, chewing tobacco, watching the ground. And the town preacher looked at Clara the way men look at things they think are broken, just enough to use. The bidding started slow. One man tossed in $3 and a dented flask. Another offered 2 chickens and a quarter saddle. The auctioneer smirked. Well now, what's her worth, boys? That's when the wind changed. The hooves came slow, deliberate. Not the hurried clatter of a man with business, but the solid thump of someone who already knew how this was going to end. He wore a long, dust-dark duster that moved like smoke when he dismounted. His hat stayed low, shadowing his eyes. A saddlebag swung from his shoulder, heavy enough to pull his lean frame a little off-center. Without a word, he dropped it at the auctioneer's feet. When it hit the boards, something inside thudded. Weightly, silver coins spilled out, tarnished, some sticky with old blood. No one spoke. The auctioneer blinked. That'll cover it. The man didn't nod, didn't blink. He just walked past the preacher, past the sheriff, past the dozen men who'd stared too long at Clara's legs. When he reached her, he cut the rope at her wrists with a flick of a knife and draped his coat over her shoulders. She hadn't realized. She was shivering until the warmth of the fabric hit her skin. He led her by the reins of her own mare, walking slow through the town like a man leading the dead from a battlefield. The townsfolk stepped aside, not out of kindness, but because whatever he wasn't theirs. The ride-out was silent. Clara sat stiff in the saddle, her arms under his coat. She watched the stranger ahead of her, his broad shoulders unmoving, the rifle lashed to his saddle, never jostling. There was an old wedding band looped into the leather of his bridle, half polished by years of sun and salt. They rode until the sun began to bleed down the hills, and the town was a memory behind them. His land appeared suddenly, like it didn't want to be seen, a crooked fence, a leaning barn, and a cabin with a porch that tilted rightward. One side of the roof looked burned, the edges warped and blackened like a wound left open too long. He didn't say anything. Just handed her a tin cup filled with bitter coffee and walked into the barn. The door creaking shut behind him. Clara sat on the porch, the coat still on her shoulders. She sipped the coffee. It scalded her tongue and tasted like earth and iron, but she didn't complain. She hadn't spoken in 3 days, didn't intend to start now. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Wind whistled through the dry branches of a tree long dead by the well. The rocking chair beside her moved slightly, in the wind, creaking once, then stopping. She watched the sun vanish behind the ridge. The wind pulled gently at the coat on her shoulders, tugging it like a child asking a question. She pulled it tighter around herself. Night settled like dust on skin, slow, heavy, inescapable. Behind her, through the warped cabin window, she saw the last of the firelight inside flicker and fade. She didn't ask his name. He hadn't asked hers. But the ropes were gone and she was warm, and nobody had looked at her like a possession since he'd arrived. For now, that was enough. The mornings came early out here, long before the sun cleared the ridgeline. Cold slipped through the cabin like it had been waiting for her bones to quiet. Clara wrapped herself in the stranger's coat and stepped outside to fetch water from the well. The pump handle squeaked like it hadn't been used in weeks, maybe months. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, wet hay, maybe, or the ghost of firewood from seasons past. The homestead didn't speak much, but it had a memory. Dust gathered in corners like it had stories to tell if someone would just stop and listen. There were no signs of rot or carelessness. Just time, quiet, stubborn time. Inside the main room, the rocking chair sat near the hearth, angled toward the window like someone had once stared out of it for hours. But the floor beneath it bore no scrape marks. It hadn't rocked in a long time, Clara explored slowly. She wasn't snooping, just trying to understand what kind of life had been built here. In the back room, she found a narrow bed, the sheets neatly folded, though yellowed with age. A small trunk at the foot of it creaked when opened. Inside, a bundle of folded dresses lay atop a piece of lavender-colored cloth. They smelled faintly of rosemary and of ash. One shawl, dull green knit, still held the ghost of a perfume Clara hadn't worn since her wedding night. She ran her hands over the embroidery on the hem. Small birds stitched in flight. She put it around her shoulders without thinking. The stranger passed her once in the hall that afternoon. He paused, just briefly, when he saw the shawl. His eyes didn't soften, but they darkened like clouds gathering over water. Then he stepped around her and walked out the back door without a word. She watched from the window as he saddled one of the horses and rode into the hills. She didn't ask where he went. When he returned near dusk, his boots were muddy and his shirt was wet at the collar. He handed her a bag of beans and a small bundle of carrots. She cleaned them in silence, boiled the beans in a dented pot, and set 2 tin bowls on the table. He sat across from her. Neither reached for the other's gaze. The fire crackled in the hearth behind them, and somewhere outside, an owl gave a lonely call into the fading light. Clara dipped her spoon slowly, as though time would wait for them to figure each other out. She set it down and cleared her throat. Was she your wife? The question hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't rise. He didn't answer right away, just stared at his bowl as if the beans might save him. Then finally, a single nod, barely more than a breath. He didn't eat another bite. Clara didn't speak again. She let the silence be what it was, not empty, but full of things neither of them knew how to say. Grief didn't always come with tears. Sometimes it wore boots and didn't look you in the eye. That night, when she rose to bank the fire, she passed the rocking chair. Something in her, without thinking, reached down and gave it a nudge. It creaked once, then rocked, just a little, just enough to remind the room it still could. She stood there a long while, watching it move. The flames cast long shadows across the floorboards, and for a moment the chair seemed to be occupied by something more than memory, something not yet gone. Upstairs, a stair groaned softly, old wood shifting under weight, or maybe just the house breathing again after too long held still. Clara pulled the shawl tighter around her and let the firelight warm her back. The house hadn't asked her to stay, neither had he. But somewhere in the dust, in the quiet hum of old things trying to remember themselves, she had begun to answer, ask ChatGPT. It came down from the mesa like it had vengeance in its bones, the kind of storm the earth warns you about only with silence. No clouds, no rumble. Just a sudden hush, and then the wind, shrieking as it slammed into the land and tore at everything. That didn't have roots. The first sign was the chickens. They huddled together unnaturally, no sound, beaks low. Then the horses in the corral started bucking, their eyes white with panic. Clara had just stepped outside with a pail when the wind struck. The sky turned white in a single breath. Not snowflakes, but walls of snow, thick as smoke and fast as flood. The barn door tore off with a crack loud as gunfire, slamming into the fence and shattering the top rail. Clara screamed without realizing and dropped the pail. She ran into the storm, barely able to see, her shawl snapping behind her like it wanted to fly back home. She didn't make it 5 steps. An arm came from nowhere, strong and fast, gripping her by the wrist and yanking her back toward the cabin. She stumbled, snow in her mouth, her fingers clawing at air. But he didn't let go. Not once. Inside, the door slammed shut behind them. Snow blew in over the floorboards before he wedged it closed with a board in his shoulder. His breath came, hard through his nose, jaw tight, eyes furious. not at her but at whatever force had made her believe she had to help. He didn't speak, just brushed the snow off her shoulders, then moved past her to bar the back window. The storm howled like something alive. Wood groaned. The fire sputtered. They stayed near it, adding logs until only 3 remained in the pile. Neither said it, but both counted 3 logs. Maybe a day's warmth, maybe less. The walls rattled. Snow slammed against the glass in fits. She sat across from him, shivering, rubbing her arms through her sleeves. He stood and walked to the back room. When he returned, he dropped a thick wool quilt in her lap, old, heavy, hand-stitched. He didn't meet her eyes. Clara spread it across the floor and sat close to the hearth, trying not to look at the shadows his body cast against the wall. But when the wind picked up again, sharp and shrieking, she flinched, and he stepped forward without hesitation. He sat beside her, wordless, close but not too close. Enough to share the warmth. The fire grew low. They lay that night under opposite ends of the same quilt, shoulders to the stone hearth, feet barely touching beneath the stitched stars and faded blocks of blue dot. At some point during the second night, Clara coughed. The smoke had thickened, the chimney struggling under snowdrift, and her chest burned. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She sat up, dizzy. The edges of her vision blurred. He was beside her in a heartbeat, without asking. Without waiting, he lifted her into his arms like she was nothing heavier than the memory he carried. He wrapped her in the same quilt, pulled his duster over both of them, and opened the front door into the storm-dot snow. Hit them instantly, flakes thick and soft as feathers but bitter cold. It clung to the duster, to her hair, to the folds of her shawl. He carried her to the edge of the porch, sheltered by the eaves, and sat down on the top step. The cold was bracing. It clawed at their skin, but it cleared the smoke from her lungs. She gasped once, then settled, head against his collarbone, breath slowing. They sat that way a long time. The wind softened. The snow no longer screamed. It felt like ash now. Slow, gentle, deathless, he looked out at the white stretching across the fields. Then, after a silence that felt like it had waited years to speak, he said, "My name's Eli." Just that dot, no explanation. No history. But it cracked something inside her all the same. She didn't respond. Just pulled the quilt tighter, his arm. Stayed around her shoulders until the wind finally died. Back inside, the fire had nearly gone out. He built it back up while she sat on the quilt, her hands in her lap, her heart somewhere else, somewhere near a man who held pain like a rope pulled too tight. She didn't ask more. Didn't need to. That name, offered in the quiet aftermath of the storm, was the first bridge laid between 2 broken shores. They'd both survived something that wasn't meant to be survived, when the fire blazed again. He sat back down beside her, just far enough that they still shared the same breath, and outside the snow kept falling, not to bury, but to soften the world they hadn't known how to live in until now. When the storm passed, the world outside looked like it had been erased and redrawn in soft white chalk. The drifts melted slowly under a stubborn sun, and mud replaced snow in the yard. With thaw came rhythm, quiet tasks repeated without instruction. Clara chopped kindling in the early hours while Eli hauled water and repaired the chicken coop that had nearly folded under the weight of snow. They rarely spoke, but they no longer needed to. Some mornings, she sat at the front window and braided her hair while he read from an old leather-bound ledger by the fire, his brow furrowed over columns of faded ink, numbers that no longer mattered, pages too warped to hold profit. Still, he turned them slowly, as if reading memory more than math. She watched him sometimes, not with longing, not yet, but with the strange comfort of someone whose presence had become a habit. She wasn't ready to break. They moved around each other like music without melody, practice steps, a silent rhythm. He never touched her, but the spaces between them began to close in ways she couldn't quite name. One morning, her shawl caught on the corner of the rocking chair. She bent to free it just as he crossed the room. Without a word, he knelt, untangling the fringe with thick fingers. His hand brushed hers, brief, warm, calloused. She didn't pull away, but she felt something shift. Not fear, something worse. Or better. The ache of almost, he looked at her then, just for a moment. Not like a man watching a woman, but like someone seeing something too fragile to name. She stood up too quickly. The chair creaked behind her, rocking once and falling. Still, later they argued, over a door hinge, of all things. She said it needed replacing. He said it would hold fine. The words were stiff, brittle, too loud for the cabin. She slammed a pot on the table. He flinched, not from the sound, but from something deeper, the ghost of voices raised in other homes. In other lives, he left without putting on his coat. Rain had started again, fine and cold as nails. She heard the barn door open, then shut. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The stew on the stove bubbled over. Left to itself, she didn't eat that night. Just stared out the window, arms crossed over her chest, shawl still knotted around her shoulders. The rain traced long lines down the glass. Like fingers trailing stories they couldn't tell, she slept with her back to the room, curled beneath. The quilt they'd shared during the storm. Sometime past midnight she woke to a sound, the cabin door creaking open. Soft footsteps. A pause outside her door, then a blanket, dry and warm, landed gently on her bed. The door clicked closed. Again she pressed her fingers to the fabric, wool, his scent. Pine, smoke, wet earth. He never said sorry. He didn't have to. The next morning, the stew was warm again. Wood crackled in the fire. And he stood near the window, staring out like the land might speak if he waited long enough. She didn't ask where he'd gone. She just brought him a mug of coffee and set it on the table. He nodded once. She saw the cut on his knuckle. She didn't comment, only turned back to the hearth and stirred the pot. From then on, their silences changed. Still quiet, but no longer empty. He lingered longer by the fire now. She let her voice rise softer when she spoke. Not every glance was returned, but some were. Not every movement was deliberate, but a few were close enough to matter. They were still strangers in some ways. But strangers who knew how the other took their coffee. Strangers who could sit in the same room for hours and feel more at ease than if they'd been talking. That night, the rocking chair rocked again, not because she touched it, but because he passed by and bumped it lightly with his knee. It moved. Just once, creaking softly. She smiled in the dark, not because it meant anything certain, but because it meant something. Things break, things hold. The hinge still swung after all. The light was soft that morning, filtered through clouds that hadn't made up their mind whether to weep or wait. The cabin held its usual hush, but something in it had shifted, like the walls themselves were listening. Clara had just finished, sweeping when she noticed him at the edge of the porch, standing beside the rocking chair with something cupped in his hands. He didn't speak, just held the small wooden box toward her, old pine, hand-carved, the lid worn smooth from fingers long gone. She took it gently, nodding once before sitting on the steps, letting the quilt drape over her knees. She opened it slowly, her breath catching the moment she saw what lay inside. A few tiny tools, dull from use but carefully wrapped in cloth. 2 buttons, one still threaded with blue, and a single dry braid tied with a faded red ribbon, curled like a sleeping thing at the bottom. She was 6, he said. His voice cracked not on the words, but between them. Her name was June. Clara looked up, but he wasn't looking at her. He was watching the tree line, jaw set tight, hands buried in the pockets of his coat. She didn't say she was sorry. Didn't offer her a prayer. Just closed the box and held it in her lap like a heartbeat she'd borrowed. He turned and went inside. Not abruptly, just as if his body had gone where his grief had been living all along. That evening, while he fed the horses and checked the fence posts, Clara found the old photograph again, the one that had gathered dust behind the lamp in the sitting room. The child's braid was long and loose over her shoulder, tied at the end with what might have once been red. Her eyes were too big for her face. She looked like she'd known the world wasn't fair from the moment she'd learned to walk. Clara sat by the hearth and undid her own braid. The cabin was warm from a day's fire. She brushed her fingers through her hair slowly, deliberately, then wove it again, not in her usual tight coil, but loose like the girl in the photo. She tied the end with twine. By the time he stepped back in from the cold, she was sitting in the rocking chair, hands folded in her lap, the braid resting softly down her spine. The firelight lit it like gold. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than usual, then closed it softly behind him. He didn't speak until the kettle started to whistle and she rose to take it off. "You don't have to stay," he said, the words low and shaped like something he hadn't said aloud in years. Clara turned, her hands still wrapped in the towel she'd used to lift the kettle. Her voice was steady. "I didn't stay," she said. "I came back." He blinked once, then once more. The silence that followed wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that holds something, delicate between two people who know how easily it can be lost. She poured the water into a pair of cups and brought them to the table. One stayed untouched. His fingers hovered near it, then withdrew. She sat beside him, close, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the warmth off his shoulder, the way his breath dipped when hers rose. The fire snapped gently behind them. The smell of cedar ash drifted through the room, sweet and sharp. He glanced at her braid once, then away. She reached for her cup. He didn't reach for his. They didn't need to speak anymore. Not about June, not about staying, not about what had passed between the storm and this quiet moment by the fire. They just sat. And the silence, for the first time, felt like trust. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in slow waves, brushing against the window pane with the hush of a lullaby. Inside, the untouched coffee cup steamed quietly, waiting for nothing at all. "You said." The knock came just after sunrise, sharp against the wooden frame like it had been waiting weeks to land. Clara was shelling beans at the table, hands steady, breath still. Eli opened the door. The preacher stood there, hat in hand, the same one who'd watched the auction without blinking. His collar was too clean for the trail, boots polished for an audience, not for walking. Behind his smile sat something sour, the kind of rot that hides under polite tones and folded hands. "Just came to check," he said. "Town was wondering." His eyes flicked to Clara. "You're well, I hope." She didn't stand. Didn't speak. The preacher turned to Eli. "You do know she was trouble, don't you?" Before all this, wild, ran with bad folk. There were whispers. "Best be careful what you keep around." Eli said nothing. Didn't even blink. Clara rose then, slow, deliberate. The wooden chair scraped softly across the floor. She walked to the doorway and stood between them, the sun warming the edges of her shawl. Her voice was low but clear. "You sold me once," she said. "You'll not speak for me again." The preacher blinked but didn't answer. He looked at Eli as if expecting correction. He got none. Just silence, the kind that burned. He left, red-faced, boots tapping too fast on the porch boards. Eli shut the door behind him. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The fire crackled. The wind shifted. Something deeper settled in. The bones of the cabin. Eli stood near the window, watching the preacher's figure disappear into the horizon. Then slowly, like a man approaching a skittish colt, he turned to Clara. His hand came up gently. No command, no claim. Just a touch. His fingers brushing the curve of her cheek, reverent, as if afraid she might vanish. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it. That evening, they saddled 2 horses. No one said where they were going, but both knew the ride into town was slow, unhurried. The sky had turned the color of wheat touched by dusk, and birds called from high above the cottonwoods. Clara's braid swung softly against her back, her shawl catching the sunlight in a shimmer of blue. Eli rode beside her. The rifle stayed strapped behind his saddle. The old wedding band still looped into the bridle leather, not as a wound anymore, but a remembrance. A marker of who he'd been and who he was learning to be. They passed fields and fences, dry, creek beds, and a line of blackbirds resting on the rail posts. Every hoofbeat sounded like something leaving, something arriving. In town, heads turned. This time, no one offered coins. No one dared call her by the names they'd once whispered. She walked tall beside Eli, her boots echoing on the plank floor of the mercantile like they'd belonged there. They bought flour and coffee and a tin of lamp oil. Clara picked up a small quilt, soft blue cotton with hand-stitched stars, from a Navajo woman seated outside the store. The woman didn't speak, just smiled gently and placed the bundle in Clara's arms. Eli paid. Clara folded the quilt over her saddle horn Dot as they turned to leave. The breeze lifted dust from the ground and twirled it around their boots like old spirits playing one last song. Behind them the town continued, the grind of wagon wheels, the clatter of hooves, voices rising and falling like a hymn with no end. They rode out the way they'd come, side by side. No reins between them, no chains, no saddlebag of silver. Just the quiet stretch of road ahead, and the fire warmed. Memory of a cabin that had once held only shadows. She didn't look back. He didn't need to. The quilt rested softly between them, light as a promise.